I suppose the big daddy of all, the Henry Review, and Ken Henry came out the other day, and of course Ken Henry did that review for a Labor government. Would you ever go back to the Henry Review and look at the big tax reforms?
I think it's a resource which should be trawled and reconsidered every so often. Now, people sometimes say to me, yeah, all this tax stuff you're doing, that's good, okay, but we need a big picture, we need a big white paper. I reject that view because it doesn't work. It's been tried. And if you try and do everything at once and rewrite the whole tax system at once, you'll fail. The Henry process was probably more successful than most people realise. It was actually more implemented than is commonly accepted in the political debate. But then we had, without being political, Tony Abbott try the whole tax white paper, which we never even saw, didn't get that far. If you try and boil the ocean and say we're not going to make any changes at all unless we do everything at once, you're going to be taking on, frankly, too many vested interests, too many difficult fights, and you'll end up achieving very little. The better approach is, I think, I would submit, our approach, which is identify shortfalls, identify problems, think about it carefully, design it properly, deal with it, tackle it, take on the argument. I would say in most cases win the argument, and then move on to the next one. Always with a view, of course, to the big picture as you're doing it. You don't do these changes in isolation. We don't change family trust without thinking about imputation, etc., etc. It's always coming together. But if we waited and said, well, we're not going to do one little thing until we have a map of everything, then I'll tell you what would happen. The same things that by and large has happened, which is very little.
Because, of course, if you do win government at the next election, you'll probably have an obstructive Senate as well. You can't know.
We won't have a majority in the Senate in our own right. The Labor Party hasn't had a majority in the Senate since 1949. But we've done a few things in those years, the Labor Party in government. I think our track record of getting things through the Senate is pretty good. Now, obviously, we haven't had a majority in the Senate for one day since 1949, and in those times we've had Hawke Keating and Rod Gillard and obviously Whitlam, so we've got a fair bit through. I do accept, of course, the Senate crossbench is now more disparate than it was. In the old days you had bigger moving blocks. You had the Democrat, Labor Party, Democrats, the Greens, and now it's more dispersed. Now, at the next election will be the first actual election where this government's Senate reforms will be effective, because last time, in a rather significant miscalculation, Malcolm Turnbull reformed the Senate voting system and then called a double dissolution election, which made his reforms meaningless. This time, actually, the reforms will work because it'll be a half Senate election, so that'll have some impact. We'll see what it does. But I have a high degree of confidence in dealing with the Senate. I'm not suggesting everything's going to be smooth or easy. But we'll be treating them with respect. We'll have the moral authority of a mandate, which Christina would have spoken about in her stroke my speech. And by and large, it's one of there's two reasons why I think our approach gives us a better opportunity to set it. One is the moral authority of the mandate, and two, because issues have been percolating through the community for so long now. Negative gearing reform, for example, we announced 2 years ago. The debate's been had, the issues are understood. If you go to the Senate and say, look, we've got this great idea, we're going to vote for it, you're going to scare the horses. Where you've actually shown that you've been able to have the public debate and win the arguments, you're in a much better position with the Senate.
Yeah, okay. I did want to ask you about, and your speech had this in it. You've got two policies still on your website under your Fairer Super plan. One's tax on income in retirement over a certain threshold. The other one is that 30% tax on contributions for those incomes over $250,000. I think a lot of people would say, well, the Coalition has delivered those changes to make that system fairer, the taxation of super fairer. So they've sort of delivered that. You're also introducing your input tax credit charges or changes. Are you saying that you will still leave your original two super changes there as well as the dividend imputation changes?
Yes, and just step it through. We announced our original superannuation policy in February, I think it was, 2015.
Yeah.
Government, of course, railed against it, so they wouldn't touch it. Then, in their budget, they adopted elements of what we'd done, but they also did other things which we wouldn't have done. But, we do acknowledge that they came a long way towards our position. We at that point announced those other two policies and said, well, we think these are legitimate and appropriate thresholds, and that they are our policy. To just go that little touch further, I think it would be a fair characterisation. I recognise the government's got a long way there, but and our imputation policy was in the speech, vital for budget repair and vital for improving the progression tax system, but it doesn't mean that those other things aren't important either.
Okay, so those other two changes or policies will stay.
Yes.
So that does mean a fair bit of tinkering to super when you get in.
Well, there'll be changes, yes, absolutely, with necessary changes in our view. We've reached the end of what I would call our taxation changes in superannuation. As we've said, we're thinking about gender equity and some other issues. And we fear that the government will delay the next increase in the superannuation guarantee, and we won't be agreeing to that. But I regard them as separate superannuation tax changes. These are positive changes which we are continuing to work on. But then, of course, what we'll do is establish the Council of Superannuation Custodians, which the FSC has informed my thinking about. Not so much the Council of Superannuation Custodians, which has been a clear policy for some time, but the 5-year
reset for
linked to the timing intergeneration report was an FSC idea, which I thought was a good one, and so we've adopted that as our policy.
Excellent, thank you. In terms of the dividend imputation changes, you walked back a bit from your original stance on that. Were you surprised at the backlash and also the criticism that you targeted SMSFs deliberately?
Wasn't surprised by the size of the backlash. We always knew that we were walking into a firefight doing this. We know this on all our policies, and in fairness, if there's a criticism, I thought we were walking into a firefight and a backlash on discretionary family trusts as well, and that didn't eventuate. That's to
come, is it?
Well, no. I mean, it's been adopted, it's been out there, been out there for 6 months, and the government has not laid a finger on it, frankly, and there hasn't been that sort of... It's pretty hard to justify income splitting for tax minimisation purposes, but still I thought we were going to be into a firefight. So, I mean, sometimes these things are difficult to judge. There was a firefight which didn't eventuate. I'm not saying that there won't be more pushback, but you can't turn up 2 years later and say that policy the Labor Party announced 2 years ago is an existential threat to your existence. That doesn't work. Now, on imputation, the size of the pushback did not surprise me in the slightest. On the changes, we always knew that the vast majority of the revenue was coming from the top 20%. And and self-managed super in particular, the very large self-managed super funds. We always knew that. A very small amount of money was coming from the low end, but that became the political issue, frankly. And we reached the view that when you could exempt 25% of the recipients, which pensioners, part pensioners, but save 94% of the revenue, and then concentrate the argument on what you're actually doing rather than scare campaign about pensioners, because the political problem we faced was the vast majority of pensioners were unaffected, 90% of pensioners were unaffected, but because of the scare campaign, many thought they were affected. And that means you're not cutting through with your argument, and it's an important argument for us to win, and so it made sense for us just to, sometimes leadership's about listening as well, just to recalibrate that slightly, but importantly save 94% of the revenue that we had identified through that measure.
Do you think you've got it right? Do you think you'll win this argument, or do you think there are more unintended consequences to come?
No, look, we don't do these things lightly. We're the only country in the world that does it. It's an anomaly.
Paul Keating. Was Paul Keating's invention?
No. I said, well, I'm glad he's not here because he wouldn't like that comment. He invented dividend imputation, absolutely, but only in 2000 was it made refundable. So this was a Howard Costello change, which completely changed dividend imputation and removed it from the principle of double taxation. Now, it would be wrong to get rid of dividend imputation. Some people suggest it from time to time. It would be.
It helps a lot of charities and a lot of institutions.
Yeah.
Charitable bodies and.
Well, and they're exempt from our changes, but Dividend imputation in itself, in the 1987 to 2000 model, avoids double taxation, and double taxation should be avoided. That's the right model. It's transformed the way capital is formed in Australia. The refundability element is not integral to capital formation and is not integral to the dividend imputation model that Keating set up. And obviously I spoke to him well in advance of making this decision as the father of imputation. And he said, well, of course, returning to that model is a perfectly sensible thing to do in this budgetary environment. At $8 billion a year, which is what it's growing to, it's simply unaffordable and not justifiable in policy terms. If you had the situation where all shares were held by retirees in the tax-free phase, we'd just be giving back all the corporate tax that's collected. We'd take zero tax out of corporate Australia, which is not sustainable in the slightest. And somebody's got to call it out.
It's a hard argument. And I know we don't want to prosecute it now because that will come in the election campaign, I'm sure. I do want to ask you, though, about the Royal Commission. And I know you can't pass running commentary on it, but would Labor have done it I know you would have done it sooner. Are you interested, pleased with how it's going? Do you think it will achieve its purpose?
We would have had different terms of reference. But I'm not going to quibble about that. We're glad it's underway. The Royal Commissioner is showing every sign of a very thorough job. And while I'm not going to provide a running commentary on every day's worth of evidence, obviously, I don't think there's been any indication thus far that the Royal Commission is unwarranted, and indeed quite the contrary. I think even in the early days, the early stages, the evidence has been disconcerting and has supported the need for the Royal Commission in the beginning.
I know when we spoke last time about this, you said you would have liked to have seen the regulators,
Yes.
APRA and ASIC, inside that Royal Commission as well, under examination. Do you
in
still
terms of the financial
agree with that?
regulation architecture, because one of the strengths of our financial regulatory system since Wallace has been clear responsibilities for each regulator. Everybody knowing what their responsibilities are, you knowing what their responsibilities are, nothing falling through the cracks and very few grey areas. I don't think that's the case anymore. Through ad hocery, things being added to each regulator. APRA having responsibility for BEAR. Macro-prudential regulation being more macro than prudential. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it is more about macroeconomic management than the health of one institution, which was APRA's core responsibility. So it's all become, I think, more blurred. And I think there needs to be an opportunity to step back and say, well, all these changes have occurred. Do we have every element of it right? I'm not suggesting, far from, am I suggesting big sweeping regulatory architecture changes. I'm not suggesting we'd move away from the Twin Peaks model or abolish or create new organisations. But the sharing of responsibility between the regulators is now more confused than I think it has been, and that's a bad thing. And as a result of that, the Council of Financial Regulators is now much more important. The fact that they interact with each other through the council is much more important. And we don't know what happens there. It's an opaque group, a bit like the Reserve Bank was pre the 2004 reforms, where everything was done in a black box and, they didn't announce the interest rate decisions till the day later and you never saw any minutes.
Now they put their minutes out.
Yeah, well,
all of that.
But now the Council of Financial Regulation is much more Financial Regulators is much more important. And that's a good thing. They're very fine regulators and they should be interacting with each other. But we don't know what's going on there. And so all I'm saying is that all these things have changed, and I wouldn't want to see more ad hocery, just dealing with the regulators on issues that come up. I would be looking towards a process to step back and say, well, do we have all this distribution of responsibilities correct? I mean, I do not know why APRA has BEAR. It makes little sense. ASIC would be the natural home for BEAR. APRA is now a prudential regulator and a supervisor. That's a fairly significant change. Now, we didn't move amendments in the House,
But you'll correct that?
What I'm saying is these are issues that need to be considered in a very careful and methodical way.
We've only got a couple more minutes, and I know I'm holding people over, but it's really important that we ask you, questions. The BEAR, you did mention it. You obviously like it. Would you extend it to other sectors? The PJC said they wanted on life insurers, which we said that's not right. That shouldn't be on life insurers. What would you do with BEAR?
Well, the one amendment we did move was a delay for smaller institutions because it was just simply unacceptable to expect them to comply with it on such a short timetable. I have no plans to extend it. I didn't design it. It wasn't my idea. It was a diversionary tactic to try and stop the Royal Commission. Now, that's not to say it's a bad thing, but that's what it was designed to do. And as a result now, frankly, as I say to the banks, you've got the worst of all worlds. You know, you've got the Royal Commission, and you've got the BEAR, and you've got the bank tax, all these things which were designed to avoid the Royal Commission, and you've still got the Royal Commission. But having said that, it's a change to the regulatory framework. We supported it, but that doesn't mean that necessarily I think it should flow through to other parts of the sector.
Okay. You mentioned extending the superannuation guarantee perhaps to women on parental leave. We're looking at
all sorts of options. I mean, the gender retirement income gap really annoys me. It really drives me as a policy agenda. The income gap through the working life compounds for reasons we all understand. It gets worse and leads to far too many women retiring into poverty. And we shouldn't accept that. That's not okay.
Absolutely.
Now, there are all sorts of policy mechanisms which are floating around, none of which in and of themselves will fix the problem, but all of which could make a contribution. We've got to find the best value way of doing that. We've been working through that. But what we don't do is come out one day and say, well, we've got a solution to this problem which we haven't told you about before. You know, on all these things, we've talked about the problem as well as the solution. And that means ideas come forward. You'll have ideas, your members will have ideas, and all ideas are gratefully received. But I make no apologies for saying the retirement income gap is unacceptable in Australia in 2018.
Absolutely.
And government should be doing something about it.
Well, I don't know. I think people have got to start engaging with super from their very first job, and that's a job for superannuation trustees.
All that's true. All that's true, but we've been saying that for a long time. You know, and
technology is going to help us, though.
Sure. With the best will in the world, though, we are not going to get an 18-year-old to focus on their retirement income, male or female.
Call it something different.
Yeah. We could try, and I'm not saying we shouldn't try, and all those things are important, but we've also got to get the policy levers so that even for those disengaged people, for people who have no choice, you know, more and more people are working multiple jobs now, as you know. Casualisation has led to actually more people in more jobs but lower paying.
And we're seeing products now for those people too,
which
is innovation. Great thing.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. But we've got to make sure the regulatory settings are right as well. Women, by definition, take more career breaks, by and large. All these things have to be weighed up.
Okay.
But it is pretty high in our thinking and policy development.
Okay. Very quickly, Chris, I know you want to, you probably do want to hit the greens out of the park with the idea for the RBA to become a people's bank.
I don't think it's particularly well considered. What are the problems with it? One, as we, in no particular order.
It's terribly ill-considered, isn't it?
Ill-considered.
Ill-considered.
I said not
terribly
well-considered.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
Right. So you could,
Yeah.
What are the problems
It's
with it?
Bad idea.
Yeah, in no particular order. One, as we know, if you just provide people with more capital, you're just going to drive up prices, point one. Point two, of all the problems facing the Australian economy and purchases at the moment, high interest rates isn't one of them. So, you know, making interest rates slightly lower, and it would only be slightly lower, is hardly the solution to our problem. Particularly if it's not part of a broader package of reforms like negative gearing, investors, etc. And finally, from my point of view, it exposes the Commonwealth balance sheet to the housing market directly, which should be avoided. So it is not a plan that will be adopted. No.
Thank you. Okay, very restrained. Very quickly, withholding tax, which is going to be very, very difficult. If we don't, it'll be difficult for the Asia Region Fund's passport to get off the ground if we don't fix this. Would you look at that as a priority?
Well, as you know, we did things in office, particularly when I was Financial Services Minister in this space. I would have an open mind going forward and would be happy to engage with you about what options are and where we're at. To be honest, it's been a little while since I looked at our competitiveness in this space, so if there are issues which we should be considering, we'll consider them and happy to receive feedback as we do so. I mean, the whole Asian Funds Management Passport is very important to us. We're pleased with the progress. we present some progress. We would have liked to have been quicker, but we're not going to quibble. But the entire Johnson regime, I'm seeing him later today actually, the entire Johnson regime will be something that we would want to refresh and turbocharge in office. And if withholding tax is part of that conversation, happy to have that conversation.
Thanks, Chris. On that note, I do want to thank you. It's been terrific of you to get here finally. It's a labour of love.
I can only apologise, but I only realised when I got in the car that the Harbour Bridge was shut. Otherwise, I might
you would have been on the train.
Well, I might have. It was all too late, yes.
Yeah. No, Chris, thank you. We really appreciate it. We know how far you travelled and how hard it was to get here. We really appreciate you making the time, and it was fantastic for Senator Keneally to be here to deliver your words.
As you can see why we put her in the Senate, that she was able to step in at the last minute. So.
Thank you very much, Chris Bowen. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just finally, before you go off to your meetings, which are probably running a little bit late because Sydney's running late, I want to thank you all for coming. And my final thanks, of course, go to Melinda Howes and the BT team. We could not do this engagement without you. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for supporting the FSC BT political series. Thanks very much. Thank you.